Good morning, and thank you for joining us here at the Boston Public Library for a late morning edition conversation. I'm Jeremy Siegel, co-host of GBH's Morning Edition and the Wake Up podcast at GBH. And here with me today is Gregory Maguire, the mind behind Wicked. Gregory is the author of several dozen novels, including Wicked, which inspired the hit musical and the upcoming movie, and many more books: Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister, most recently The Witch of Maricourt, the latest entry to the Wicked sequel trilogy. Gregory Maguire, good morning, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Gosh. I feel like I'm at the Oscars. Thank you so much for awarding me this honor.
We promise not to play you off with any music at the end.
Oh, go ahead.
For everybody joining us this morning, I do want to give you a heads up. If you're just hanging out in the cafe or if you're here for this conversation, you will have an opportunity to ask Gregory Maguire a question if you have one. This is your opportunity to have anything answered. We will be having a Q&A portion of the conversation later, and my colleague Annie, who is right here raising her hand, will be the one to find, once I let you know that we're taking questions, you can just head on over to Annie. She'll get a line going, and she'll give you a microphone where you can ask your question. So, without further ado, let's begin our conversation with Gregory Maguire. Gregory, I wanted to start with the movie, which actually was in the spotlight a little bit at the Oscars last night. Ariana Grande was there in a Glinda-style dress, which I've seen making the rounds on social media this morning. Part one of Wicked, starring Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande, comes out later this year. I know movies are made well in advance of their release date, so I just have to ask, have you seen it?
I have not seen the movie, nor did I even know that the trailer was being dropped at the Super Bowl 3 weeks ago.
Gosh.
Nobody tells me anything. Nobody sends a postcard to the old grandfather and says, "Granddad, wake up from your nap. Turn on the Super Bowl for the first time in your life and watch something interesting."
So you weren't watching?
I wasn't watching.
Okay.
Everybody else in the world saw it before I did. But the next morning, my media, as they say, blew up, and I went and found it. So I have not seen a cut, and I don't expect to. I expect to be at the premiere, and then I'll see what they do. But Jeremy, what I did do was about almost a year ago, I went to London and I hung out at the sound stages in Elstree Studios in Boringham Wood, North London, to watch about 5 days of filming. So I do have a sense of what the sets are like and what the performances are going to be like.
Well, I know you probably have to be a little mum on what you're able to share, but what can you tell us about what you saw?
Well, I do have to be mum on some things, but what I can speak about with alacrity and passion is how much I learned about the art of acting by watching Cynthia Erivo, Ariana Grande, and Jonathan Bailey perform in one scene that was taking 5 days to film.
One scene over
just
5
one
days?
Scene.
Wow.
I think, because I know what the soundtrack is going to be playing over it, I think the total amount of film footage that they're going to get out of 5 days of work is about 4 minutes. So They did everything 6 to 12 times, and I watched them play different moods. I watched them play different transitions, and I was amazed at the capacity of people that I think of primarily as singers to, just for surprise, be as talented and as precise and as intellectual in their approach to the reading of a scene as they are to the shaping of a melodic line, let's say. It was mind-boggling for me, whose mind likes not to be boggled.
Did you get a chance to speak with any of them? Have you met any of the?
Oh, I did. Yeah. I'm not going to pretend that we hung out, at the bar for hours on end afterwards. But I got the chance to speak to each one and hang out a little bit. The person with whom I had the longest conversation was Jonathan Bailey. Just by happenstance, we sat down on a sofa that was on the set. So I was like in the scene, but not dressed to be a munchkin or anything. And I asked him questions about acting. I said, I watched you perform in this scene where you had no lines. You were just doing reaction shots, and yet I was compelled to keep staring at you. And it's not because you're good looking. It's because you were doing something. How did you do what you were doing? How do you do a reaction shot? What is it that you were achieving, or how did you achieve what you were achieving? And he did not want to answer my question. He didn't want to give away the tricks of the trade. And I don't blame him for that. And I'm not going to give away his tricks either. But he did tell me one thing which surprised me. He said, well, for this scene, I approached it as if X. And so he invented something else that he might imagine watching. And he acted as if he was responding to that, which gave him the flexibility of facial muscles and of expression to correspond with what was happening elsewhere on the set. And I'll tell you, I thought, there's a reason I didn't go into acting, because that's too smart for me. I really admired it, though.
I should remind folks that Jonathan Bailey is playing Fiyero in the adaptation, and that Cynthia Erivo will be playing Elphaba, who is the central character of Wicked. I don't think anybody needs a refresher on what Wicked is about, but the reimagining of the Wicked Witch of the West. And Ariana Grande will be playing Glinda. And I dug up an old interview where a year before Ariana Grande was announced as being part of the cast, you were asked to sort of do some dream casting, and you said, quote, I sure was thrilled with Ariana Grande singing The Wizard and I at the 15th anniversary TV special of Wicked. She just really knocked it out of the park. I thought she was great. You also mentioned in that interview envisioning a young Antonio Banderas as Fiyero, which of course didn't end up happening, but you did sort of predict the Ariana Grande thing, and I was wondering, as the person who created these characters, or invented the version of the characters that we know in Wicked, Glinda, Elphaba, were you consulted about who would be transforming into them on the screen?
No, not a word of consultation, and I don't say that with any approbation. When I made my agreements both with the producers of the Broadway show and downstream, the producers of the musical, I quite intentionally gave them permission to proceed without my creative veto. And I did this, Jeremy, for the simple reason that L. Frank Baum, the original author of The Wizard of Oz, had not come out of his grave to haunt me and go, woo, when I decided to take his characters and try to retell his famous American fairy tale for a different audience at a different time in American history. He didn't disturb me, and I was allowed to proceed with full creative license. And I thought the least I could do was not disturb the creators of the musical or of the movie. Let them do their thing. They're the ones with the expertise in these fields, not me. So consequently, I'll be just as as you on the day that it opens to see what it is that they do, with one exception. I did see many of the sets, and about which I'm not allowed to talk. But I think that I'm guessing that in Elstree Studios there might be 11 sound stages, and more than half of them were filled with sets. I don't know if that's common. It seems to me like that was a lot of that property. I think Wicked was possibly the only movie being filmed in the studios while I was there, because it's such a vast set of films.
So you can't say what the sets looked like, but did they match with what you paint such a beautiful picture of things like Shiz University in Wicked, everywhere we go to in the book. Did the sets look like how you imagined it?
I'm going to answer in a slightly digressive way. If you saw the trailer that dropped, you have seen how, say, Shiz University was conceived, and Shiz University, as the movie sees it, is nothing like how I saw it. I saw Shiz University as if it could have also been used for a reboot of Brideshead Revisited, at Oxbridge, whereas Shiz University looked more like a Fantasia of Venice, as you saw in that 3-second clip in the trailer. So, no, it doesn't match what I saw, but it matches or exceeds in weird particularity what I saw. And isn't that, I suppose, what the art of art design is in films? To make something so specifically itself that once you see it, you think, well, of course it was like that. It can't have been anything else but that, until you go back to the book.
We're talking with Gregory Maguire, the author of Wicked and dozens of other books, at the GBH studio, at the Newsfeed Cafe, at the Boston Public Library. We're going to chat more about Wicked because I can't not talk about it. I love the book. I'm so excited for the movie. But I wanted to talk about the beginning of it all for you. You've written so many books, and of so many different kinds. I mean, beyond Wicked, which I think an older teen could probably read, but it's an adult book, but you have several young adult and children's books as well. Where did it all begin with you? Was it as a child for you when you fell in love with writing and knew that that's what you wanted to do with your life?
If you're talking about where did writing begin, yes, it began in childhood. If you're talking about where Wicked began, yes, that too began in childhood.
Oh, really? Okay, I want to hear about both.
Two different origin stories, but the needle gets put down in the groove at roughly the same moment. I am from a family of 7 children that was not one of the prosperous families in the neighborhood. We were middle class, but we struggled to have enough, money to go around. And my parents were very strict in an old-fashioned, almost Edwardian sort of way for reasons of family drama. They wanted to keep us corralled and keep us safe. There was a lot of anxiety in the genes. And so almost the only liberty that I had growing up was the liberty of the library card, a liberty that one could use here at the Boston Public Library and that I have done many hundreds, if not thousands of times. The library card was my passport to worlds beyond the curbs that I could not cross without permission, right up until I was about 14. And so the interest in story, probably as a kind of therapy for my fervid imagination, was instilled very, very early. The ability to read and the license to read were the main gifts my parents gave me in childhood, besides love and food and donuts every third Saturday. But the interest in the story of The Wizard of Oz, incidentally, came almost at the same time as my ability to read when I was 5 or 6, because my parents, also strict about everything, as they were. I mean, how strict were they? We weren't allowed to ride two-wheeler bicycles until we were 16 and had passed the New York State driver's license exam. We had to know the rules of the road before we could get on a two-wheeler. And that's only one example. That's an example I can say in public. That's how strict they were. But they were also strict about TV. They were kind of dubious about the blandishments of the 3 channels of TV we got. Even PBS hadn't quite arrived when I was a child. And so our TV watching was really restricted. But once a year, they let us watch The Wizard of Oz when it was rebroadcast. I think it started in 57 or 59, being broadcast once a year on TV. And that annual arrival of the telling of a story cemented the story of The Wizard of Oz into my psyche in the same way that the annual rehearsal of, let's say, the stories of the Gospels that I heard at church every Sunday were cemented into my story as part of the foundation myths of my life, or the myth of George Washington and the cherry tree. It's just something that's planted there, and it becomes part of how you think about the whole world. Part of your moral and conceptual structure of the world is affected by these early stories. So once a year, we gathered in the living room. We watched The Wizard of Oz. We did not know that when Dorothy opens the door from Kansas and walks out into Oz, that she goes from the black and white world to a color world, because nobody had color TVs in my neighborhood. I don't think they were invented yet. I didn't know what was in color until I was, considerably grown up. But what we did know is that this child made the same kind of magic adventure for recovery, repair, and return that any child makes when they open the cover of a book, leaves behind the traumas and also the consolations of their real life to engage with the challenges and the consolations of somebody else's experience.
Were you
So I
s-
see they're kind of like each other.
Were you scared of the Wicked Witch of the West when you were a child?
I was terrified
Yeah.
of her. I'll get you and little dog, ta-ta, or Titi, or ta-ta, whatever it's called. I was terrified of her,
Toto,
yes.
right? Toto.
Toto, yes, thank you. Glad you passed that test. And I was also scared, of course, of the flying monkeys. But by the time I'd seen the show maybe 5 times, so maybe I'm 10 years old now, I began to realize that the wizard who lied to Dorothy, who sent her off into danger with no expectation of being able to pay his debt to her, was just as scary, if not, in fact, scarier. The witch, yeah, you know, she's menacing to my dreams still, but she never lied. She never lied to Dorothy. She never tried to trick her. She said exactly what she felt, and she did exactly what she said she was going to do. The wizard dissembled and lied and put Dorothy and her friends at grave risk. Now, I'm old enough, Jeremy, so that when I was in first grade, second grade, third grade, school children were just becoming aware of the conflict in Vietnam, a conflict that would hover over my own childhood right through high school. My whole childhood was lived in fear of the war and in fear of possibly being drafted and being sent off to kill the Wicked Witch of the Viet Cong. And so, in a way, the power structure of who gets to make the decisions and who has to carry out the campaigns just sort of became part of the substratum of my moral thinking about authority and about power. And so, in a way, as I say, I think the story of Wicked began by watching the film and by ingesting and digesting what it was saying about power structures.
That's
and
so
about men and
fascinating.
women, too.
It's fascinating using something that exists in pop culture as a way of exploring power structures like that and exploring morality like you do in Wicked. And you were, in a way, it feels like ahead of your time with that, because there's been such a fascination with revisiting existing intellectual property, mostly in television
Right.
and in movies at this point, and especially looking at anti-heroes, which you could, of course, place Elphaba in that category.
Right.
We've seen it almost done, some would say too much at this point when you think about
Sorry
like the
about
Marvel universe or something. Well, I wonder though, do you think it's a worthwhile endeavor to continue returning to these things that shaped a lot of people's childhoods?
I think it's always a worthwhile endeavor to reassess your own assumptions, wherever they come from. If they come from art, if they come from the stories that you were told, if they come from the family stories that you heard around Thanksgiving, yeah, listen to them, enjoy them, but we keep growing, we keep developing our critical skills of assessment, and we must always, for our good and the good of those who are in our lives, we must always reassess what we think we know down to our core and see if it's still true. That, I think, is actually part of our critical faculty as being agents of, and then maybe not change, but agents of correct behavior as citizens and as family members. So I don't think it's bad to do that, but yeah, I do think it can be a bit overdone. I do want to say, because I'm quite aware that Wicked was certainly not the first one. I mean, you could say Shakespeare did this too. He took old stories and put a new spin on them and changed them up a little bit and rolled them out at the Globe Theater and brought in the money from the box office. One of my idols in teenage reading was not J.R.R. Tolkien, who was all the rage when I was in high school, but instead was T.H. White with his Once and Future King. Much later, after Wicked was sold and was out, it was actually my stepmother who read it and said, I see the DNA of the Once and Future King in your conception. And I said, darn it, Mommy, you're always smarter than I am. You're still smarter than I am. I hadn't seen it. But I do agree that admiring that book as I did, I think I took in the chutzpah that he was able to locate in himself to say, oh, sure, everybody knows everybody knows King Arthur, everybody knows Merlin and Guinevere and Lancelot and Camelot and blah, 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 blah. I'm going to tell the story as if it's never been told before. And I'm going to make it about what I think is important to think about right now as we are on the lip of World War II. How do we use responsibly the power that we have? When must we fight? And when must we cease from fighting? That's what he was writing about. And he took the material at hand and wrote a book so magnificently funny and profound that I could read it once a year for the rest of my life and still enjoy it. I think that book, probably more than anything else, was the hidden template that I was working on without even realizing it. But my stepmother told me she saw that I was cribbing. I was cribbing from the cliff notes of The Once and Future King.
So you endeavored to do a similar thing. You wrote Wicked, and you've written several more novels in the same universe, for lack of a better word.
I started my own history. I didn't want to give it. I didn't want to call it Dark Oz or anything. But I just wanted to, train my binoculars on the landscape and see what was it that I could see. And lo and behold, you change one little bit of the story, and then the story keeps changing. I'll give you an example of this. When I was little, after we watched the movie, I was kind of the boss kid. I don't know. Are you from a large family?
I'm from a family of 3 brothers total.
Okay.
So not large,
that's
not small.
That's not large in my neighborhood. Something's wrong with that family. In my neighborhood, where a family of 7 was a middle-sized family.
Wow.
There were lots of families with 12, 13, and 15 kids.
Well, how many siblings did you have?
I had 6 siblings.
6 siblings,
Yeah.
okay.
So, but in every large family, there's often a boss kid, and I was the boss kid. I was the middle kid, for one thing. But I was also the idea man, so when little kids had to be babysat, I was young enough to be forced to do it, and I was old enough to have ideas for what to do next. So after The Wizard of Oz showed, I would gather my brothers and sisters and the kids around the neighborhood, and I'd say, we're going to put on The Wizard of Oz this afternoon, guys. It's going to be in the backyard, and I would assign parts. We'd all seen the show the day before, so I'd say, the lilac tree is going to be the tornado, and the hole underneath the back porch can be where Dorothy's house lands on the Wicked Witch of the East, and let's go. And so I'd assign parts, and we'd all sort of play it out.
So you were already creating The Wizard of Oz as a child.
And so the funny thing is, it's a 92-minute film. Actually, if you take out all the music, you can run through the whole story in about 12 minutes. So we would run through the story, and then, I would have to babysit for another, 90 minutes. What are we going to do next? So I'd start losing my crew, and I'd say, people, listen up. We're going to do this again. We're going to try it again. We're going to mix it up a little bit this time. I would do some cross-gender casting a lot earlier than it was considered respectable to do. I would say, okay, Michael, you can be the Wicked Witch of the West, and Matt, you can be Dorothy, and Annie, you can be Captain Hook. And Annie, who was 5, bloody little fundamentalist, would say, but that's not right. There's no Captain Hook in this story. And I'd say, excuse me, I'm the author. It's my story. This time, Captain Hook is in the story. He's going to meet the Wicked Witch of the West. They're going to have twins. They're going to call them Little Snookums and Little Hookums. Go. And so we'd start playing it again. But you add just one new element to what you already knew, and the story cannot end the way that it used to. The story has to be different. And so in a way, my ability to write stories was a result of my ability to play, like any child's ability to play, to take what you have, make something new out of it. If that doesn't work, take it again, scramble it up, and make something new again. So once you do that, you own the story. Now, it helps if the story is in the public domain. You can't really do that with Marvel Universe characters yourself. Only the people who own the copyrights can do that. But when I wrote Wicked, I did not know, this was one of the many pieces of good luck in my life, I did not know that as I was writing the novel, the estate of L. Frank Baum was months away from coming out of copyright. I had assumed it was in the public domain already for decades. and I never thought about it. I sent my manuscript to my agent in 1994, I think, and he said, "How did you get to be so smart? This has only been out of copyright for 6 weeks." And
you accidentally did the savviest business.
Just good luck. I was the first one out of the gate by good luck and instinct, I suppose.
So it sounds like you've, in essence, been working on this project your entire life, starting with the recreation of The Wizard of Oz in your backyard. And it's really stuck with you. I mean, the New York Times, in an article, I think from a decade ago, referred to you as Mr. Wicked. and when I was reading that, I was thinking, that's an awesome name. That's really cool. But also, I was wondering whether it ever feels like an inescapable title. Does it ever feel like a lot of weight, or that you just sometimes want to get away from the Wicked Witch of the West?
That's a really good question. And the truth is that for the last almost 30 years, my life has kind of been overcast by this green cloud. And it does change who I am and how I behave in the world. It's true. It's given me a wide readership, and it's given me name recognition. And once in a while, a cute waitress or a cute waiter in a restaurant will actually recognize my name on my Visa card and then make me feel very smug. Doesn't happen often enough, but once in a while. But generally speaking, as it happened, I was with my boyfriend, then husband, just beginning to raise a family of adopted children from overseas at the point where Wicked, the novel, went from being a bestseller to being the inspiration for a Broadway play, where then it went stratospheric. I mean, the book sales went stratospheric.
It was a bestseller.
It was already
a decade
a bestseller,
after its publication.
And then it shot up, 4 times as much, and the size of my professional profile subsequently changed. But if you are at home and there is a caterwauling going downstairs because you've run out of Cheerios, that becomes a more urgent moment to triage solve than the fact that Oprah is on the line and waiting for you to answer whether you can come next Tuesday. Say, "Sorry, Oprah, I got to go get the Cheerios. We'll talk later." And I mean that both comically but seriously. Raising the children was my top priority from the moment the first one came into the house. And that, I think, although I didn't do it for therapy, that I think helped me keep my feet on the ground and keep from getting swept up in my own cyclone of self-approval or other people's approval or dismissal. Not everybody loves my work, and why should they? Oftentimes I don't like my work either, but.
Did your children enjoy you being Mr. Wicked? Were they fans of The Wizard of Oz or of Wicked as they grew up?
I will tell you 2 things about that. My husband is a well-known painter, and when we were on Oprah, at one point, Oprah was interviewing us all together, and she said, "Kids, how does it feel to have 2 dads, one of them a famous painter and the other a famous..." Before she could even finish her sentence, the 3 kids, as if they had rehearsed off stage, went blah, 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 blah. So that was their attitude toward having professional artists as parents. They didn't care. When I did take them to see Wicked, and they were still pretty young, they were too young really to follow it. But then we came home, and then we watched The Wizard of Oz. They hadn't seen it first, and they disapproved of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, starring Margaret Hamilton and some child star wannabe, I forget her name. And they thought, "Oh, that's not right. They've made her into a jerk. She's not like that." So I wonder how many kids these days are actually more aware of Elphaba than of "I'll get you a little doll."
Yeah.
So makes no difference this way or that, but it is a funny turnabout of cultural tweaking, let's say.
Did you come up with? Well, I assume you came up with the name Elphaba. How did that happen?
I did. I wanted a name. For one thing, I wanted the character to have a name. I thought the fact that she didn't have a name in the story meant that it was easier to demonize her. If you call somebody the jerk or the tramp or the robber, and don't call them Bob the jerk or Bob the tramp or Bob the robber, then you're somehow subtly denaturing them. and taking away their chance at full humanity. Even if you never give it to them, at least they have a chance at it with a name. So giving her a name right away was important. And I wanted it to be a name that was memorable and didn't really evoke other kinds of names of English-speaking people. So I invented the name by playing with the initials of the author Lyman Frank Baum, LFB, and I wrote them down on the paper, and I tried aspirating them in different ways. I tried Lafaba, I tried Lafeba, and then I tried Elphaba. And as soon as I got Elphaba, I thought, oh, that's it. That's not really very pretty. Elphaba's not a pretty word. It's not like, did you know that J.M. Barrie, Peter Pan, invented the name Wendy?
No.
The name Wendy did not exist before the play Peter Pan
Wow.
in 1900 or the novel in 1904. Peter Pan and Wendy, he invented it.
Wow.
I didn't want to invent a name that was so pretty
That it would stick?
that it would become universal.
Well, do you know if there are any children out there named Elphaba?
I know there are
these days?
lots of cars named Elphaba and a lot of pets named Elphaba. If there are children, I haven't been told about them yet. But also, I just will say that the word Elphaba also sounds a little bit like the word alphabet. And it seems to me that if you're going to be casting magic spells, you need a magic alphabet. So alphabet. So it really worked for me.
I'm chatting with Gregory Maguire, the author of Wicked and dozens of other novels. I'm Jeremy Siegel, co-host of Morning Edition at GBH. We are at the GBH studio at the Newsfeed Cafe at the Boston Public Library. We're going to be taking questions shortly, so maybe if you're interested in asking about something, have it in your head, and my colleague Annie will be making a line shortly. So just want to let you know that soon we'll be taking your questions. But I wanted to talk a little bit about living in Massachusetts. You mentioned you live here with your husband and raised your kids here. What keeps you in Massachusetts? Because when I've spoken to people saying, the author of Wicked, Gregory Maguire, he lives just outside of Boston, and they think, what? Not New York, not London? But at the same time, reading Wicked, thinking about, say, Shiz University, I was imagining a Northeastern university, kind of thinking about these people maybe being in somewhere like Cambridge.
Yes.
So it feels like the Northeast makes its way into your work, but what keeps you out here in Massachusetts?
Well, I have lived in Cambridge. I have lived in London, and we have a place in France that we go to quite often now, thanks to that green cloud that occasionally will drop down a little parcel of money. But what keeps me here is partly Logan Airport is close to London, 5 hours if you've got a tailwind, and I really do like that. I am a transplanted New Englander. I grew up in Albany, New York, so not the city. Sort of my blood leaches from Brooklyn up the Hudson River Valley to Albany, which has a lot of Brooklyn influence in it. And I came to Boston to attend then Simmons College for a master's program. And it seemed just that little bit, well, more than a little bit. Albany is a great town. I don't mean in any way to disregard it. I was back there last weekend. But Boston seemed that little bit smarter and more urbane and more connected to the rest of the world than Albany did and does. And that appealed to me because I didn't want to be, parochial in how I live my life. Also, I'm a natural fit for Boston because I'd like to think I'm not stodgy. When I came to Boston, I thought everybody was stodgy. This was 45 years ago. But I am earnest and I am serious. And I take intellectual campaigns seriously, even if I only conduct them in the privacy of my own boudoir. It's still, thinking is important to me. And Boston and New England relishes the importance of the mind, has done so from the 18th century, probably 17th century too, now that I think of it. Yes, indeed, from the 17th century. So I feel at home here. I feel like the Boston area, New England, is a coat that fit when I came here at the age of 23, and it still fits. Maybe it's a little tattered, but I think it suits me.
You once said in an interview that when you're writing and when you're thinking about your fiction, you almost think about characters in a radio play when you think about dialogue. And I loved hearing that one as a radio host, but also I found that fascinating. And just speaking with you right now, I mean, you're very comfortable taking on voices of characters. It sounds like from an early age you were acting out radio plays in a way with your family. So
I'm trying to be polite here. You haven't heard nothing yet.
well, let's hear a little bit more. I mean, what is it about sound that fascinates you about writing as well?
In addition to writing and doing some painting and illustration, I was, in the early part of my life, also a musician, and a composer and a performer. I had designs of being either the next, Paul Simon, or maybe the next Carly Simon, or one of the Simons in there. And so I also led a choir, so I'm comfortable with opening my voice and letting it out. I also taught a great deal. Before Wicked finally hit, I made most of my income by speaking to children in schools all around the United States, outside the United States, but especially in New England. So you get to a school, let's say it's Reading, Massachusetts. You come in and you've been told you're going to talk to the 5th and 6th grades, and collectively there are 125 kids. They're crammed into the library. But then a teacher runs in and says, the water mains exploded in the kindergarten and first grade wing, so we have to bring kindergartners and first graders in too. Everybody scooch back and let in another 125 kids. So you're talking to people, very different age groups, and trying to keep them calm. And now there's 250 or 300 kids there, and you're on. So I learned how to govern a crowd by the use of my voice and by certain kinds of hammy tendencies, kicking over trash baskets and singing and drawing on the board, doing whatever I could in order to make the operation work. And I feel comfortable doing that. I think it's partly from being from a large family, but partly from having an instinct to teach.
We'll be taking your questions for Gregory Maguire shortly. Do we have any yet? Annie, if we do, we can take them now. Okay, great. So if you have any questions, come on up to my colleague Annie.
Don't be shy.
I'm not shy. Oh, my name is John Christopher Mulhern. I'm a docent tour guide at the John F. Kennedy Library. I have a question. Do you believe that the term Camelot aptly describes the Kennedy presidency, and was that the beginning of the downfall of the United States, in your opinion? And secondarily, in your opinion, is there a difference between the public's right to know versus the public's need to know? And thank you very much.
Those are two great questions. The first one is easier to answer for me. I do think that wasn't it Jackie Kennedy who first described the Kennedy administration as Camelot? And I think I don't know whether she did it until after her husband had died. I actually read something about this fairly recently, but I forget what I read.
I recently watched the movie Jackie, which obviously takes a lot of liberties, but it opens with her playing the record.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I do know that they admired it, but whether it was she who applied that term to the now terminated presidency, that I'm not sure. Does it reflect a high point of American experience? That's a job for Doris Kearns Goodwin. Is Doris here? Doris, can you answer that for us, please? She's a friend of mine, but she apparently had something else to do this morning. She's not here. I think it's certainly a question. It's a question worth asking. I can see you around the camera. It's a question worth asking, and I'm not qualified to answer it, but I think if the answer is yes, it's a question worth unpacking further to say, if yes, then why yes? What was going on then that made this a high point of our sense of hope and expectation? And what has happened since then to cause our sense of hope and expectation to ebb so thoroughly at times that we feel we can barely breathe? I'm not weighing in on whether I think it's yes, but I think the downstream questions underneath the question that you asked are worth all of us asking for ourselves, because it is in considering that we begin to learn how to move forward, how to put back the foundations of some Camelot, some place that might have an aspiration that is higher and more inspiring than that which is given us by, no offense, Jeremy, the media, by common culture, by the new structures of chatter online, and the question, how can we revive a sense of carrying a torch of something worth working for, worth even sacrificing for, how we can revive that sense in ourselves and in our culture. I think that's what your question is actually asking. And I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's a great question to ask. And it's the kind of question I ask myself almost every day. What good can I do in the world today? Not how much money can I make, or can I get my name back into the name and pages column of the Globe, which I don't think exists anymore. But what good can I do? If I can do good for one of my kids, or for somebody I see on the street, or if I can write to somebody and maybe just tweak a little change, can I do that thing, and will I do that thing? I challenge myself, and some days I fail, and other days I remember to succeed.
Well, you spoke a little bit earlier about about the things happening around you shaping the way that you took in fiction and thought about fiction and shaped writing Wicked. You were mentioning fears surrounding the Vietnam War. I mean, as you've gone through writing more and more of this series and your other books, have you found that the period that we're in societally has shifted the way that you've thought about the world of Oz, or what else you're writing about?
Oh, yes, and I have an absolute perfect example of that. Jeremy, Wicked was published in '95. The Broadway show opened in 2003. I loved it. There was this huge, big, noisy musical extravaganza that everybody was asking me about. And yet, I knew, as much as I admired the musical, and do, that the musical had soft-soaped some of the social agonies that I was trying to shed light upon in my novel. It had turned, the musical version of the story has turned my story into a bittersweet drama from what it originally was intended to be, which was a tragedy. The death of a character in midlife, a character with agency and hope, is always a tragedy. And I intended this book to be Shakespearean in its reach for sorrow, in its reach for the disappearance of the witch and her incapacity to achieve what she had wanted to achieve was meant to make us feel, as readers, terrible. Go get a drink. And then, how am I going to make my life be other than that? It's going to inspire us not to give up ourselves, to work on behalf for those who are cut down too young, like President Kennedy, let's say, like Elphaba. And so when the musical came out and everybody was singing and dancing their ways into the hearts of America, well, nobody, likes singing Broadway. I'm like, I didn't resist. But I did think my story was taken and reshaped, with my permission, to serve a larger audience and possibly a younger audience, and there were things in my story that had to be left out of the Broadway show, and will be left out of the film, I'm sure. I could live with that. I had my kids to raise. I had done my work. Then the Gulf War, the Abu Ghraib, the situation at Abu Ghraib happened, and on the front of the Boston Globe came those famous photographs of the man with a hood on his head and electrodes clipped to his fingers and extremities, standing on a box in the prison, being threatened with the fear of death if he fell off the box. And this image, so horrific to me, so painful, and not just to me, just take the me out of that sentence. This image was so horrific that I thought I was going to have a brain collapse of shock and distress. And I thought to myself, all right, Gregory, you have always used your capacity to create to give yourself therapy, to do something for yourself that you can't accomplish in any other way. You need to go back to Oz, and you need to reclaim your picture of Oz as being just as corrupt and dangerous as the world in which we live. It's not candy-colored. It's not the all-singing, all-dancing Munchkin Review. It's a world that mirrors the sadness and also the hope and possibility of the world in which we live. So that, and that alone, is why I went back to Oz to write Son of a Witch. Son of a Witch ends up being about the son that Elphaba and Fiyero have, or had. You don't see Elphaba and Fiyero having a child in the Broadway musical, but in Oz, they had a child, and he was there in Wicked. And by the time Abu Ghraib came about, I began to feel I needed to check in on him. I had my own children now, and their well-being was important, and my characters are important too. So I went back to Oz to follow his life and see what happened to him after his mother died and what he did. And what did he do? Among other things, he went into the army, folks. He went into the army. One of my kids is in the army right now. So maybe I'll go back. Maybe I'll go back one more time and find out what I think about it now. This is, for me, what fiction is for. It's to survive the angst of living.
I think we have another audience question.
I was afraid Jeremy was going to ask this. My name is Judy. I'm a fan. I've read several of your books before Wicked came out.
Well, thank you.
On Broadway. So, yeah, I thought it was just really creative and interesting take. I'm curious, were you just born with this sense of social structure and understanding, or is that something you studied at some point, or did your parents instill some sort of really intuitive understanding of sociology and social structure? Or was it from coming from a large family?
Well, Judy, that's a great question. I'm going to repeat it a little bit in case your voice didn't communicate completely. The question is really about whether my understanding of social structure and sociology came from my family or my education, or have I made a study of it? And I will answer you, in some ways, Judy, my sense of social organization and the way parts of the motor, the engine, the gears of society work came despite my family rather than because of them. Now, of course, they came because of my family, because in a family of 9, 10 people, well, here's a social puzzle. If you have 9 people and the day-old donuts only come in boxes of 6, how much of a donut does every person get in order to be fair? The answer, 3/4. 3/4 of a donut. That's really hard to work out when you're 7. Like, keep cutting them in different segments to try to make everything fair. So in a way, my understanding of how to be fair in a social situation, it came from lived experience, as they call it, as if all experience isn't lived. But in another way, Judy, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, in another way, Judy, I have to say my curiosity about how structures worked came despite my family. And this is why, like Jeremy, my father was a journalist. He was a writer for the Albany Times-Union. He was a reporter. He was a human interest writer. And in the second half of his career, he became a humorous columnist. But he came from a school of journalism, and by that I mean the experience of journalism. He didn't get any schooling beyond high school. He came from the practice of journalism, let's say, that suggested journalists are obliged by the card of their trade to offer no opinion about what's happening, about current events. They are simply to report what they know to be and can verify as facts. And so therefore, if at the table somebody wanted to talk about, let's say, Vietnam, let's say the bombing of Cambodia, let's say this or that or the other, even right up to the Watergate tapes, my father would forbid the discussion of current events at the table.
Even in private?
Even in private, even at the family table of 9 people. I now see that he also had a heart condition. He didn't want to fight with us, and he didn't want to die with his face in the mashed potatoes. And we didn't want that to happen either. Well, some days we did, but mostly we didn't. And so consequently, I came into college education, and pretty much came out of college education because I lived at home in college, being a real babe in the woods about even how I thought about how the world was set up. I had experience of it from being a practicing Catholic, from being in a large family, from being closely integrated with my even larger families and my networks of friends, et cetera, and all my reading. But I didn't have any practical experience until I came to Boston. So maybe when you're asking, why did I like New England? I came to New England in part to get out of the comfort of my own family cloak and to try to put on other clothes that would allow me the liberty of knowing more that had been suggested to me it might be permissible to know. That's I can't stand the shape of my sentences when I hear them in my head. But anyway, I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
That I had to explore intellectually when I came for graduate school, what is it that we know and how is it that we know it? Those are questions I began to be able to ask myself when I was about 23 that I never thought to ask myself in childhood.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Morning Edition producer, but I have a question. I was wondering, something I'm really curious about is the way that fans interact with a body of work. So, with worlds that are so expansive, like Wicked, Harry Potter, Star Wars, all those things. I'm wondering what your favorite way is of how people have interpreted, like fan art or costumes or clubs, or what's your favorite way that you've seen people interpret your work?
Well, I didn't hear your name, and maybe you didn't.
Oh, it's Rachel. I didn't even
Rachel.
say it.
Okay. I'm big family. I got to find out who's everybody at the table. So Rachel, I have a sister named Rachel, so I'm familiar with that name. That's a great question about what sorts of things give me the most pleasure about how fans interact with my work. I've seen it all. I've seen living dioramas of everybody dressed up in characters, usually from the Broadway play. I've seen fan fiction of dubious moral slant, which I enjoy. I've seen illustrations by artists so incredibly strong that it makes me weep to think of the amount of time and effort people have put into considering what it is that I tried to paint for them. But I think probably, Rachel, the thing that I like best are letters and interviews from middle school kids who, or even 5th grade maybe, who have not yet reached the stage of gestational reconstructionism, hormonally speaking. So they are still able to throw themselves with huge passion into the worlds that they have encountered in the library, or, on the stage, soon to be on the TV screens and movie screens too. And the zeal with which they try to interpret what they see of what I have provided them is no less than the zeal that I applied to the données of Oz, as given us by MGM, as given us by L. Frank Baum in his original novel and in the 13 other novels he wrote, because he wasn't good at money management and he had to keep writing them.
Before I let you go, I was wondering if there is a piece of advice that you would leave for someone who is a 4th or 5th grader, maybe a kid who's entering the Boston Public Library today and falling in love with reading and writing like you have. I mean, you've had such an incredible career and love reading and writing so much. What would you tell a young kid who's experiencing the same thing you did decades ago?
To give the advice in as succinct a way as I can, and you've already found out, Jeremy, I'm not very succinct. I would say to any child, go to the children's room and get that important work of childhood, Harriet the Spy. Read Harriet the Spy and learn from that novel, Harriet the Spy by Louise Fitzhugh, more than 50 years old now, more than 60 years old, how a 12-year-old girl in 5th or 6th grade, I think she's in Upper East Side of Manhattan, interpreted her life through the agency of a notebook in which she observed and wrote down what she saw, and she wrote down questions of things she didn't understand. All my favorite books in childhood were fantasies, except for one. And the one that wasn't a fantasy, Harriet the Spy, is the book that taught me how to be a writer. I knew how to be a reader. I knew how to love literature from reading and from my parents. I knew how to be a writer from watching that my father and my stepmother and my older siblings did it, but mostly from Harriet the Spy. So I would say, read Harriet the Spy. Sure, the first 8 pages are boring. You can skip them. Start with chapter 2. Read Harriet the Spy, get a notebook with a real pen, not something online. Carry it around and begin both to look at the world, but to look at yourself looking at the world. That way you learn 2 things at once. You learn about the lovely, nubile, textured experience of any moment that we all are lucky enough to be witness to, but you also learn to look at yourself looking at it and then begin to learn to question your own assumptions. Those are 2 things that writers need to do. I started a journal when I was 12 years old. I kept it for more than 50 years by hand, 57 volumes, and I'm still keeping it at the age of nearly 70, but now I do it online because my hand hurts.
Author Gregory Maguire, thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
joining
Jeremy.
me this
Thank you,
morning.
everybody. It's been really great to be here. I really appreciate it.
And Gregory is the author of Wicked. This is my copy that I'm going to be hounding Gregory for a signature of after we finish talking. He's written dozens of novels in addition to this. You have been listening to a GBH Morning Edition conversation later in the morning than we're usually on the air. Thank you, everybody who joined us at the Newsfeed Cafe at the Boston Public Library today, and have a great rest of your day.
Yes, and thanks for the questions.